I always thought my wedding day would be the happiest moment of my life. But instead of joy, it turned into chaos I never saw coming. One moment I was smiling in my white dress, and the next, everything exploded. My mother-in-law, with her cold words and fake tears, twisted my husband's mind right in front of me. And then he snapped. He yanked my hair, slapped me across the face, and shoved me so hard. My head slammed into the corner of the table. What happened after that was even more shocking. Hello, my name is Nina Carter, and I'm 28 years old. For as long as I could remember, I had dreamed of this day, my wedding day, believing it would mark the beginning of a joyful new life. The venue was decorated with soft lights, pastel roses, and the gentle sound of violins floating through the air. Guests laughed and clinked their glasses, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the aroma of the evening feast. As I stood in my white gown, surrounded by people clapping and smiling, I felt like a fairy tale bride. I had chosen love, and I believed I was walking into something beautiful. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. My fiancé, now husband, Ethan Reynolds, was charming, well-spoken, and always knew how to make others feel comfortable. We had been together for 2 years, and I had thought we understood each other. I believed we were building something strong, something lasting. I smiled politely as guests came to greet me, complimenting my dress, my makeup, my glow. I nodded, responded with warmth, doing my best to absorb every joyful detail. Then, through all the laughter and soft music, I heard a voice that immediately turned my stomach. "Nina, dear," the voice called, sweet on the surface but edged with something sharper, colder. "Could you come here for a moment?" I turned and saw Margaret Reynolds, Ethan's mother, standing a short distance away. She wore a tight smile, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes scanning me with judgment. There was no warmth behind that smile, only calculation. Her tone wasn't a request, it was a demand. I hesitated briefly, then politely excused myself from a group of friends and walked toward her. The moment felt strange, but I told myself to stay calm. After all, this was my wedding day. I had every reason to be happy. But as I neared her, I could see something was off. Her back was straight as a board, her expression forced. Something dark was brewing beneath her pleasant exterior, and I was about to walk right into it. As I stood in front of Margaret, I offered her the same polite smile I had given every guest that evening. "Is everything all right?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, though a quiet tension had started to settle in my chest. I knew Margaret and I were never close, but I had tried my best to be respectful throughout our engagement. What she said next, however, caught me completely off guard. "It's about the way you look at me, Nina," she began, her voice cool but dripping with blame. "You think I haven't noticed? The way you sigh, the way you roll your eyes when I speak. I may be old, but I'm not blind. You don't respect me, and now, on my own son's wedding day, you've been worse than ever." I blinked, stunned. "I think you're misunderstanding me, Margaret," I replied gently. "I've never disrespected you. I've always tried to be polite." "Polite?" she snapped. "You're cunning. You've been turning Ethan against me since the beginning. And don't you dare pretend otherwise." Her voice grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby guests. I noticed heads turning. A few people whispered behind their hands, sensing the tension that was now thick in the air. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Margaret, I promise, that's not true. I want nothing more than peace between us." At that moment, Ethan appeared beside us, clearly sensing that something was wrong. His eyes darted between his mother and me. "What's going on?" he asked, brows furrowed. Before I could say a word, Margaret reached for his arm with trembling hands and leaned in like a wounded mother. "Your wife has been cruel to me," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "She talks down to me, treats me like a burden. Even today, of all days, she's been nothing but cold." Ethan's expression shifted instantly, concern turning into disbelief, and then into something harder. "Is that true, Nina?" he asked, staring straight at me. "No, it's not true," I said, heart pounding. "I've never treated her with disrespect. She's lying." Margaret interrupted with a dramatic sob. "I'm your mother, Ethan. I raised you. Would I lie to you on your wedding day? The moment felt unreal. I was standing in front of the man I had just married, being accused of something I hadn't done, by someone who had never accepted me. And now, all eyes were on us. Ethan's jaw tightened as he stared at me, his breathing shallow and uneven. I could see the storm rising behind his eyes. For a brief second, I still believed he might choose to trust me, to stand by me and defuse this madness. But that hope shattered the moment he muttered, "You've been making a fool of me," under his breath. Before I could step back or even process what he meant, Ethan lunged forward and grabbed a handful of my hair, yanking it back with such force that I stumbled. A sharp cry escaped my mouth as pain shot through my scalp. Gasps erupted across the room. I saw shocked faces frozen mid-toast, a few guests dropping their glasses in horror. Then came the slap. His palm cracked hard across my cheek, the sound echoing through the silent room. My skin stung instantly, and my head snapped to the side. I barely had a moment to register what had happened before Ethan, eyes wild with fury, shoved me violently in front of everyone. My balance gave way, and I went crashing toward a nearby table. The corner of it slammed into the side of my head, and I collapsed to the floor, dazed and bleeding. I could feel warm blood trickling down from my scalp, my vision blurring, and my breath coming in short gasps. The room had gone silent, completely silent, except for the sounds of people gasping, screaming, and shuffling in shock. Someone shouted, "Call 911 now," and I vaguely heard footsteps rushing across the floor. A female voice cried out, "She's bleeding. Oh my God, she's bleeding." Everything around me felt distant, like I was watching it from underwater. My heart pounded, my cheek burned, and pain throbbed in my head. But even worse than all of that was the truth crashing over me. The man I had just married had not only humiliated me, he had attacked me in front of everyone. Within minutes, red and blue lights began flashing outside the venue. The police arrived, accompanied by paramedics. A crowd had gathered, but everyone moved aside as officers entered the hall. Ethan stood frozen, his chest heaving, face pale now that the reality of what he'd done had sunk in. Two officers approached him. "Sir, put your hands where we can see them," one said firmly. Ethan raised his hands slowly. "Wait, I didn't mean," he stammered, but it was too late. "You are under arrest for assault and domestic violence," the officer said as he handcuffed him. "You have the right to remain silent." Margaret tried to intervene. "This is a misunderstanding. She was provoking him," she cried, but the officers ignored her and separated her from Ethan. One of the paramedics knelt beside me, gently checking my wound as another officer asked me questions and took witness statements from guests. As I was lifted onto the stretcher, I could barely speak. But inside, something had shifted. The fairy tale had ended, violently and publicly, but the truth was finally visible to everyone. The ambulance ride felt like a blur, filled with sirens, flashing lights, and the steady voice of a paramedic asking me to stay awake. My head throbbed painfully, and every jolt of the vehicle sent fresh waves of nausea rolling through me. I was too weak to speak, but I held on, not just for my physical survival, but because something inside me refused to let this be the end of my story. At the hospital, the emergency team moved quickly. I was given pain medication, and the bleeding on the side of my head was cleaned and treated. The doctor confirmed it was a deep laceration and a mild concussion. They ran a scan to rule out internal damage, and thankfully, it came back clear. But I would need a few days of rest and close observation. The staff was kind and gentle, though I could see the concern in their eyes as they reviewed my chart labeled domestic assault. I lay in a quiet room later that night, the sounds of machines softly beeping around me, the sharp smell of antiseptic in the air. I stared at the ceiling, my face swollen, the bandage around my head tight and uncomfortable. I replayed the moment over and over. The way Ethan had snapped, the way Margaret had pushed the situation, and how no one had stepped in until it was too late. And yet, I didn't feel like a victim. Not anymore. The pain, the injury, the shame, they were all very real. But something else had risen up in me too. A fire. A will to fight back, not with violence or rage, but with the truth and the law. I had given my trust to the wrong people, but now I would reclaim my power one step at a time. The next morning, an officer returned to take my full statement. I told them everything: Margaret's accusations, Ethan's reaction, and the attack itself. Several guests had already given statements confirming what they saw. The officer assured me that charges were being processed and that Ethan would remain in custody. Before he left, he asked gently, "Do you intend to press full charges, ma'am?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said. "Every charge possible. I want a restraining order. And I want a divorce." The officer nodded. "You're doing the right thing." That day, I also called a lawyer and scheduled an emergency consultation. The wound on my head may have been fresh, but so was my decision. I would not go back. I would not be silenced. And I would make sure Ethan and Margaret answered for everything they had done. After I was discharged from the hospital 2 days later, I didn't go back to Ethan's house, or even to the apartment we were meant to move into after the wedding. Instead, I stayed with my childhood friend Rachel, who had rushed to my side the moment she heard what happened. Her presence was a blessing. She didn't press for answers, didn't shower me with pity. She simply sat with me, made tea, and reminded me that I wasn't alone. But I knew kindness wouldn't be enough to protect me, not from Ethan, and certainly not from Margaret. The incident at the wedding had only been the breaking point. Looking back, I saw so many signs: subtle manipulation, emotional pressure, strange financial behavior I had ignored. Now I wanted answers, and I wanted proof. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator named Darren Cole. He came highly recommended for handling sensitive domestic cases, and when I met him in his quiet office on the west side of town, I was struck by his professionalism and focus. "Miss Carter," he said, flipping open a notepad, "I understand you're seeking evidence." "Yes," I replied firmly. "Not just about the assault. That's already documented. I believe Ethan and Margaret were hiding other things. Financial things. I think she controls his business accounts, and there were transactions I never understood. I want everything. Any emotional abuse. Any financial manipulation. Any illegal activity. If it exists, I want it uncovered." Darren nodded. "Understood. We'll begin with background checks, surveillance, and bank tracing. I'll also gather character reports from people they've worked with, or fired, or fought with. If there's something there, we'll find it." While Darren got to work on his end, I started collecting my own evidence too. I went through my emails, text messages, voicemails, anything that could support the claim that what happened at the wedding wasn't an isolated event. I forwarded it all to my lawyer and copied it to Darren as well. Rachel helped me organize files and digital folders, and as the days passed, I could feel the fear inside me shrinking. In its place grew a sense of purpose. I wasn't going to just recover, I was going to expose them. Over the next 2 weeks, Darren worked quietly but efficiently. He checked in with me regularly, sending updates that made my stomach twist each time I read them. The more he uncovered, the more I realized how little I truly knew about Ethan and the world Margaret had built around him. One evening, I sat with Rachel at her kitchen table, laptop open, as we reviewed the latest findings Darren had sent. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the screen. Multiple large transfers from Ethan's personal business account to a shell company, registered under a fake name, but the address traces back to a property owned by Margaret. Rachel leaned in, her eyes wide. "She's laundering money." I nodded. "And she's using Ethan to do it." Darren's report also included interviews with 2 former employees of Ethan's company. Both had been let go under questionable circumstances. They described Margaret as controlling, aggressive, and dangerously manipulative. She had access to Ethan's financial systems and often authorized payments without his team's knowledge. One employee even said he suspected tax fraud but was too afraid to speak out at the time. Alongside this, Darren found something even more alarming: a prenuptial agreement Ethan and Margaret had secretly altered without informing me. My original signed copy was missing, and Darren discovered an updated version filed quietly 2 weeks before the wedding that included severe financial restrictions on me in the case of divorce. It was forged. My signature had been digitally manipulated. I forwarded everything to my attorney immediately. This isn't just about abuse anymore, I told Rachel as I sat back in the chair, exhausted but burning with anger. They've committed fraud, deception, and they were planning to trap me financially even if Ethan hadn't hit me. Rachel placed a hand on mine. You've already survived the worst of it, Nina. Now, it's about showing the world who they really are. I stared at the stack of printed documents and digital files. It was all there. The abuse, the manipulation, the lies, the crime. All I had to do now was bring it into the light. The day I decided to expose everything wasn't random, it was strategic. I invited family members, friends, former coworkers, and even a few journalists I knew through Rachel's media contacts. The event was framed as a personal announcement, held in a private rented hall downtown. Most people assumed it was about healing or perhaps charity work after the wedding scandal. No one was prepared for what I was about to reveal. The room was buzzing with curiosity as people took their seats. Margaret arrived with her usual fake grace, dressed like she was attending a fundraiser, greeting guests with carefully practiced warmth. Ethan wasn't far behind, his expression uneasy, though he tried to hide it behind a polite smile. They still believed they had control over the narrative. That was about to change. I walked to the front, dressed simply but confidently, and looked out over the audience. My heart raced, but my voice was calm. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know there's been a lot of speculation about what happened at my wedding. Today, I'm here to share the truth, not just about that day, but about what led up to it and what I discovered afterward." Margaret's smile faltered. "I was physically assaulted by Ethan Reynolds on our wedding day. Many of you witnessed it. What you didn't see was the full story. Years of emotional manipulation, hidden financial fraud, and a calculated plan to trap me through forged legal documents." Gasps rippled through the room. I continued. "What I'm about to show you is not opinion. It is documented evidence, recorded conversations, text messages, forged contracts, and financial transfers that prove Ethan and Margaret's involvement in illegal activity and abuse." I turned and gave a signal. A large screen behind me lit up, displaying emails and bank transactions. The room fell completely silent. An audio recording began to play. Ethan's voice, mocking and cruel, dismissing me and laughing with Margaret about how she won't see it coming. Then, images of the forged prenuptial agreement appeared, side by side with the authentic one Darren had recovered from my original paperwork. Margaret stood up, her voice shaking. "This is slander. You have no right." "I have every right," I cut in sharply. "And everything you see here has been shared with law enforcement. There are multiple criminal investigations already in motion." Ethan looked like he'd been punched in the gut. The guests were in shock. Some stared at them in disbelief. Others turned away in disgust. "This isn't just my story," I concluded. "It's the story of anyone who has ever been deceived, silenced, or attacked behind closed doors. I won't be a victim. I won't be quiet. And I won't stop until justice is done." The crowd slowly began to applaud. First a few, then nearly everyone. Cameras flashed. Reporters took notes. Margaret tried to leave, but two detectives, who had arrived discreetly, approached her at the door and asked her to stay for questioning. I stood tall, unshaken. I had ripped off the mask they wore for the world, and there was no turning back. A month later, I found myself sitting in a courtroom, this time not as a bride, not as a victim, but as a woman determined to take back her life. The air inside was cold, sterile, and filled with tension. On one side of the room sat Ethan and Margaret, both looking far from the powerful, polished figures they once were. Ethan's jaw was clenched, his eyes empty. Margaret looked visibly aged, her usual poise replaced with fear and agitation. My lawyer, Ms. Harper, sat beside me, calm and composed, a thick binder of evidence open on the desk between us. We were prepared. We had documentation, digital records, video clips, and witness testimonies. Darren's investigation had left no stone unturned. "Your Honor," Ms. Harper began with a steady voice, "this is not just a divorce case. What we present today is a detailed account of abuse, emotional, physical, financial, and criminal misconduct. We're seeking a complete divorce, full legal protection for my client, and formal charges for assault, fraud, and forgery. The judge listened attentively, nodding slightly. The prosecution began with the most visible crime, the assault at the wedding. Several guests, including Rachel, were called to testify. They spoke clearly about what they saw, how Ethan pulled my hair, slapped me, and pushed me into the table, resulting in a head injury that required emergency treatment. The medical report was submitted, along with photos of my injuries. Ethan tried to defend himself. It was a mistake. I lost control for a second. I was provoked. His voice cracked, but no one looked convinced. Margaret's defense was weaker. I only wanted to protect my son, she said. Nina twisted everything. But their words fell flat. My lawyer presented financial records showing Margaret's access to Ethan's accounts, unusual money transfers, and the forged prenuptial agreement that had been digitally altered. A forensic specialist confirmed the signature was manipulated. When it was my turn to speak, I stood with my heart steady and gaze firm. Your Honor, I came into this marriage believing I was building a life with someone I loved. Instead, I was betrayed, abused, and nearly trapped in a web of lies. What happened on our wedding day was not the beginning, it was the final blow. But I survived it. And I am here not for pity, but for justice. There was a silence in the courtroom as I finished. Ms. Harper made the final statement. Given the overwhelming evidence, we ask this court to deliver a ruling that not only grants Ms. Carter a divorce, but also holds Mr. Reynolds and Mrs. Reynolds fully accountable for their actions under the law. The courtroom was completely still as the judge looked over the final stack of documents. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held a weight that filled the room with anticipation. I held my breath. I could feel Rachel's hand gently resting on my shoulder for support, but I kept my gaze locked on the judge, determined not to show fear. After a long pause, the judge spoke clearly and firmly. In light of the extensive and credible evidence presented, the court grants the petitioner, Ms. Nina Carter, a full and immediate divorce from Mr. Ethan Reynolds. I closed my eyes for a brief second and exhaled. It was done. But she wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, this court finds Mr. Reynolds guilty of domestic assault and aggravated battery, supported by medical records and eyewitness testimony. For this, the court sentences Mr. Reynolds to 7 years in state prison, without the possibility of early release. Gasps filled the courtroom. Ethan's head dropped into his hands. The judge then turned her gaze toward Margaret, who had gone pale. Mrs. Margaret Reynolds, you have been found complicit in financial fraud, manipulation of legal documents, and aiding in the concealment of abusive behavior. The forged prenuptial agreement alone constitutes a felony under state law. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and conspiracy. Margaret let out a muffled cry. It echoed strangely in the silent room, where everyone was now looking at her with a mix of disbelief and disgust. The gavel came down. Court is adjourned. The sound of it was final, like a door slamming shut on a long, painful chapter of my life. As the guards led Ethan and Margaret out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I stood silently. I didn't gloat. I didn't cry. I simply stood tall, knowing I had done what I needed to do, not just for myself, but for every woman who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been manipulated, abused, and made to feel small. I had taken back my voice. And, this time, no one could take it from me. Weeks passed after the trial, and with every passing day, the weight that had once pressed on my chest began to lift. The headlines faded, the public attention slowly shifted, and for the first time in a long while, I could breathe without fear. I wasn't just free on paper. I was free in spirit. I moved out of the city and found a quiet home nestled in the hills just outside a small town called Edenbrook. The house wasn't large or luxurious, but it was mine. It had a wraparound porch, a garden that needed work, and a view of the mountains that turned golden every evening. I spent my mornings with a warm cup of tea, watching the sun rise in peace. There was no shouting, no tension, no walking on eggshells, just birdsong and wind through the trees. Rachel stayed in touch, visiting often and reminding me of how far I'd come. Sometimes we'd sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing. She never treated me like a victim, only like a woman who had fought hard and won. Her friendship had been my lifeline during the darkest moments, and I would never forget that. I started writing again. Just small journal entries at first, then essays, then articles. One of them, about surviving emotional and physical abuse, was picked up by a local women's magazine. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from readers who had felt seen, heard, and inspired. I realized that telling my story wasn't just healing, it was powerful. People still ask me sometimes, "How did you get through all of it?" And my answer was always the same: by refusing to let them define me. What Ethan and Margaret did was cruel, calculated, and damaging. But they didn't break me. They revealed who they were, and in the process, I discovered who I truly am: stronger, wiser, and more fearless than I ever imagined. As the sun set over Edenbrook one evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and lavender, I stood on my porch and smiled. The woman I once was, the hopeful bride in the white gown, she was gone. In her place stood someone braver. Someone who fought back. Someone who won. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If my journey inspired you, or if you know someone who needs the strength to stand up for themselves, please don't forget to like this video. It truly helps share these stories with others who need them. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, or your support in the comment section below. Every voice matters. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like mine, real, raw, and filled with truth, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Your support allows more voices to rise and more stories to be told. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never be afraid to speak your truth.